Thank you very much for the invitation. I am an architectural historian, so I look at these things like some of the other speakers from an historical point of view. And I have previously researched architecture in postmodern architecture in East Germany, so I'm quite interested in the comparisons between both. And actually my talk relates a lot to what Martina's and before Kirsten have mentioned. What I present today is a work in progress. I will start a research semester, like a sabbatical, next term at the German Historical Institute in Warsaw. So I haven't yet looked at the archives, but I have looked at a lot of published materials from the period and taken these as a point of departure. So postmodern architecture is the last and some would say the only stylistic innovation in this apparently unchangeable Eastern Bloc. And these new curvy, colorful forms and historical references in Poland were not frequent, but they were very conspicuously different from this stereotypical idea of the gray housing block. So, and since they appeared only a decade before the fall of the Iron Curtain, they are intrinsically connected to the question of resistance and leeway, resistance against an authoritarian regime that tried to tightly regulate both arts and architecture and economy. So is this work of art or work of architecture supportive of the regime, or is it oppositional? That was a frequently discussed topic at the time, and you would find that in East Germany as well. So connected to the bigger picture is this relation between art and power. So was Polish postmodern architecture a crawling counter-revolution as claimed by Piotr Winskowski? Or was it, particularly with regard to the sacred architecture, I will come to that because Polish postmodernism is very much connected to church architecture, was it an expression of lay piety related to economic insecurity? So people going back to the church and using this because they feel insecure, as it was suggested by Tomasz Świetlik? Or was it merely an indicator of fledgling capitalism and of the growing significance of private clients and basically the erosion of the socialist system? Well, as we know from Michel Foucault, power is exerted in non-linear ways, and it involves both government institutions and the subject. So both are not static entities. So in this presentation, I will discuss the question up to which postmodernism in Poland changed both the institution and the subject, and so thus can be considered an act of resistance, somehow a driver of perestroika, as is the topic of this conference. Hope I get the next. Yeah, got it. So a few observations. First, the socialist rulers in Poland, like their counterparts all over Eastern Europe, since the 1950s have strongly aligned themselves with functionalism, functionalist modernism. And this was related to the modern aspects of socialism in general, like raising standards of living, acceptable dwelling conditions for the working classes, standardization, and this belief in the scientifically established design principles. But as has been pointed out by Kirsten and also by Martina's, the belief in functionalism was by no means limited to party officials. It was widely shared among the architectural profession, including many dissidents. So there was no clear-cut antagonism in which, for example, the state powers were represented by functionalism and the dissidents by something else. And the opposition between functionalist style and postmodern styles did not reflect any of the divides that determined daily life under socialism. So it did not reflect regime versus dissidents, or Marxists versus non-Marxists, or collectivist versus individualist approaches. And it also doesn't align with a periodization or even with individual personalities. There are plenty of examples where the same architects designed both functionalist and postmodernist buildings at the same time. So Poland was also not an unambiguously socialist economy. So the country had never been streamlined as consequently as the Soviet Union or East Germany. There had been no forced collectivization of agriculture or comprehensive industrialization of the construction industry. And particularly since the 1980s, there were architectural offices that could operate on their own account. That was, for example, very different to the German Democratic Republic. And Poland was also not a totalitarian state like the Soviet Union under Stalin. The regime was always somewhat struggling in light of repeated protests, 1956, 1968, 1970, etc., etc. And there was at least one independent institution with immense social influence, the Catholic Church. There were also strong social movements, the most famous being the trade union movement that culminated in the foundation of Solidarity in 1980. And the borders to the West were comparatively permeable, not only with regard to books and ideas, like in East Germany, but even many architects could legally work in Western Europe. And some of them found the conditions in socialist Poland at least attractive to the extent that they voluntarily chose to return. And one of them was Marek Budzyński, who went to work in Denmark in 1969. And 2 years later, he voluntarily returned to Poland. Some could say that he was headhunted because he was given the task to design the prestigious Ursynów housing district in the south of Warsaw, which you can see here on the left. So this was a functionalist blokowisko, like one of these tower block schemes that were built all over Eastern Europe in the 1960s and 1970s. It was designed for 4,000 inhabitants. And his Ascension Church, this Kościół w Niebowstąpienia Pańskiego, which you see in at the left, bottom left, which is now one of the textbook examples of postmodern architecture in Poland, was built more or less at the same time as the tower block example. So it evidences the synchronicity of functionalism and postmodernism at the time. So this building is a bold design with eclectic references. It has an expressive, quasi-Baroque facade with this big conspicuous cross in the middle, and the cross is the entrance. The building is part of a larger ensemble that you can see, which includes a church hall and administrative buildings. There are neo-historical details like this city gate type tower that you can see at the top right, or this fake historic well. And the church became also a mediated building. It was widely reviewed in official architecture magazines, and it became a model somehow for the great wave of church construction in the 1980s. The actual number of new churches that were built in the last decades of socialism in Poland vary, but some sources speak of more than 1,000 churches. That is unprecedented even in Western countries at the time, that during the 1980s you would have such an increase in sacred architecture. And the building actually evidences many aspects that are connected with resistance. The building relied on different urban principles. It is a church, therefore it's part of an oppositional institution that is suspicious to the socialist leader. It was designed in a bottom-up manner, and that is very different to some of the other examples that we've heard today, deriving from the initiative of a local priest and built to a large extent by volunteer laborers. And at several levels, they circumvented the usual mechanisms of socialist top-down planning. And the curvy forms look decidedly different from the surrounding modernist tower blocks. So you can see that actually of all these arguments that I'm pointing out here, only the last point is connected with the postmodern style. And I don't think that it is actually the most rebellious aspect in this building. Let's, for example, first look at the urban situation. Budzyński, as he was the lead architect in the Ursynów scheme, was 31 years old at the time, so very young, and he directed a team of very young architects. So, like many people of his generation, both in the West and in the East, he aimed at overcoming the shortcomings of modernism, which also in the postmodern theory in the West had pointed out. So, both at the level of architecture and of urban planning. So in line with the new postmodern principles, he aimed at a pedestrian-friendly space, at a meaningful, legible design, and at citizen participation. Most of these ambitions were soon crushed by the socialist bureaucracy, and the wider bloc scheme evolved not too different from other technocratic environments that were built elsewhere. But the church, in a way, became the most conspicuous signifier of such a new approach to the city. And Budzyński pointed out in an interview that Ursynów, quote, is an attempt to connect to the past, to the street, to the square, end quote. So that's evident in many details that are unusual for these tower blokowisko designs. The church stands at the center of the development, where according to the socialist principles, one would have expected a culture house, a school complex, or a shopping center. And in fact, a shopping center is what was originally planned. The church opens to a pedestrianized square, you see, that is flanked by mixed-use buildings, and thus reproduces this traditional logic of a small-town square. Centrality, legible spaces, clear distinction between the space and the buildings, and incremental growth, which can be seen in the plan. If you see here the plan, for example, here, this is the church, and then the surrounding church buildings, the patio here, the church hall, the administrative buildings, somewhat replicate this logic of an incrementally planned small town. So, a church at the center of a socialist housing development is certainly unexpected. But in Poland, it was not as unexpected as would have been in the Soviet Union, in Romania, or in East Germany. Church attendance was suspicious to the authority, but at the same time it was widely practiced, even among party officials. So Władysław Gomułka, the head of state at the time of this competition, he was even sworn into office with the formula "Tak mi dopomóż Bóg," like "so help me God." And in the late 1970s, the restrictions that the socialist authority had placed on visible religious life, I mean, particularly on church construction, they were gradually lifted. So this led to this aforementioned wave of church construction. So the symbolic qualities of a church building can hardly be underestimated. They combined an anti-socialist opposition with the assertion of a society in contrast to state. So society, społeczność, in contrast to state państwo, which was a very important distinction that also the Solidarity trade union made. So it was embodied not only in the central position of the church within the neighborhood, but also in the connection to the pedestrianized square. And eventually, so much suggests actually that the real conflict here was not about postmodern forms. So along these lines, it was about placing a church at the center of a tower block scheme. So priest Wojdat, whom I mentioned before, his first request for planning permission in 1976 was flatly rejected, and he only succeeded during a period of relative political freedom 3 years later. But a lot of this spirit of freedom must have lingered well beyond. When construction started in 1982, the political situation in Poland had radically changed. This was now the time of martial law, which was, Poland's freedoms had been crushed by the new military government under Jaruzelski. But promoters of sacred architecture must still have felt rather confident, which is, for example, evidenced by the fact that in that year, Budzyński was allowed to print such a statement here that you can read in an official architectural journal. This would have been impossible to publish at the time in the Soviet Union or in East Germany. So the significance of the church for public life at both operational and symbolic levels was tacitly accepted. And this seems to be crucial for the understanding of postmodern architecture. Because postmodernism, this is the point I want to make with this, became a vehicle for the vision of a non-socialist, church-centered society. So if we talk about architecture as practice rather than a system of forms, this is evidenced in the actual construction. So even under martial law, priest Wojdat was able to use personal connections and secure building materials and services for a project outside the planned economy. He could also mobilize over 100 volunteers who supported the workers every Saturday. And these came from all social classes. In retrospect, he fondly remembered how, quote, professors in welly boots were coming to the construction site and help along. And note the image of society united under common labor. This is rather a socialist idea, but nonetheless, it was mobilized in the same way for constructing this church. So, in light of the social significance, the stylistic innovations seem to rather fade, but they nonetheless inspired the debate at the time. The most significant stylistic innovations of the building were its semiotic qualities, so the capacity of the building to work as a sign, and also its ostentatious eclecticism, this conscious use of forms from the past. So this speaking architecture in this example is rather unsophisticated and literal. For example, the cross as the entrance to salvation. The same applies to this schoolbook image of national glory, 16th century, which in Polish collective imagination is the golden age. So if you quote 16th century forms, this is connected in Poland immediately to an idea of national strength and glory. And the architect Piotr Wicha relates such historic reference as particularly significant to a country such as Poland, where, quote, tradition has been destroyed so many times. And there's a long mentioning in the interview how this would actually relate to the most important and most significant periods of Polish history, including the Polish Constitution of 1791. So I mentioned the increasing influence and international exchange in 1970s Poland. And this is evidenced, for example, by the fact that the textbook examples of Western postmodernism were available in Poland, in magazines, in books, and an increasing number of architects even had traveled to the West and saw them. But my point is that the speaking aspects of the church evidence a selective reception of international postmodernism. So selective ideas were taken into this national Polish context and used there. The uptake of this influence was also, in some respect, one-dimensional. Speaking architecture was used to state, sometimes to shout and to proclaim, but it was rarely used to comment or to play. And it was not used to expand the architectural discipline or connect to theory. Martynas mentioned this just before in the context of Lithuanian postmodernism, where you say they had postmodern forms, but they hadn't postmodern theory. So just one example. One of the most conspicuous elements of the Ursynów church interior are these hanging columns that you would see on the right. And they precisely do not do what a column in architecture is supposed to do. They do not support the roof. So in a 2015 documentary, the filmmaker Agnieszka Gomułka points out the most frequent popular interpretations of this unusual design. She asks people like, why was that like that? And people say, oh yeah, there are different explanations for this. One explanation, they were supposed to prevent state security officers from hiding and secretly recording the mass. Others say, no, they were removed in order to symbolically unite the Polish people in one space under the umbrella of the church, so not to put any divisions between Poles and Poles. And others says, no, that was not the real reason. The real reason was to state that the church above all does not rest on stone pillars, but on the faith of the people. So, but what is most interesting is actually that the canonical Western interpretation along the lines of Robert Venturi or Peter Eisenman was conspicuously absent. Basically, that there could be an ironic statement against no longer venerated classical principles, that there could be a playful idea with the principles or that doubts the principles of architecture. So this was not at all mentioned in any of the publications that surround this. So one can say that in a way Polish postmodernism was far more serious than its counterpart in the West, and particularly in the context of the Catholic Church, lost to any form of irony. And this literal form of communication, this precisely not double coding, is at least visible in this building. But it is not the only one. It also can be seen in other postmodern buildings. For example, in the Holy Ghost Church in Tychy, in Silesia, by Stanisław Niemczyk, which was similarly commended in the architectural magazines at the time for making strategic use of these historic references. So the steeple that reminds medieval fortifications, or the low roof and the simple layout that reminds historic farmsteads. So Niemczyk was maybe the one Polish architect who most conspicuously rejected modern references and modern life in his work. But his popularity among the people and among his colleagues has to be seen against this background, that he embodies an anti-socialist opposition a desire for national revival, and a desire for a society centered around the church. And here we would even find that Polish postmodernism has references to Polish revivalist movements from the late 19th century, or to the historicist modern movements of the interwar period. So this is a long tradition. And I just point out that these interpretations were very different from the connotations that very similar postmodern forms carried, for example, in Italy, where it was connected to an anti-bourgeois message. Or even if you compare it to the German context, where postmodern forms came to be associated with the debate over totalitarianism. The Polish example evidences how different the same ideas how different ideas can be that are applied or projected onto the same architectural forms. So there was an aspect of resistance with regard to inhabiting the urban spaces in terms of architectural practice, so the whole bottom-up movement, and in terms of communicating an anti-socialist political message. But was there a resistance in architectural terms? A resistance to accepted cultural values? A resistance in the sense of a cultural innovation? Interestingly enough, there's very little theory on cultural change under state socialism. It is mostly taken for granted that state socialism was this monolithic entity that consolidated somehow in the 1950s with the end of Stalinism, and then remained unchanged until the end of socialism. So most theories that are focusing on cultural change are connected with the capitalist bourgeois society. So I would like to ask, can they still be applied to the hybrid context such as late socialist Poland? So Peter Berger, for example, in his famous theory of the avant-garde, lays out the effectiveness of art through its form and not through its context. So you say, well, basically the potential for cultural change that architecture and art apply are through its form, not through content such as the entrance to salvation through the church or the reference to the 16th century buildings. So according to Berger, it derives its relevance from its existence within this autonomous institution of art. But in an authoritarian regime with its categories of official art and dissident art, there is not really such a thing as autonomy. Andreas Hüssen, in his also famous book After the Great Divide, theorizes the end of the divide between high art and mass culture as one of the drivers of this postmodern paradigm change, which for him it is reflected in this fertile relation of postmodernism to pop culture, such as in the work of Venturi, Graves, and many others. But also this is predicated in a way on a capitalist Western society, because after all, what would be high art under socialism? Would it be the work of the state artists and architects? Or would it be the work of the architects that are recognized by the bourgeois opposition? Or would it be the ones that were recognized in the West as innovatives? So also these ideas that I just mentioned are predicated on discussion and debate. And in 1980s Poland, official functionalist construction and postmodernism appeared to have been coexisted more or less peacefully. There is no evidence that the regime attempted to impose a functionalist style. The attempts, for example, to oppress this church construction were always based on the fact that it was a church and not that it had the wrong style, the wrong formal expression. On the contrary, postmodern architecture was openly discussed in the state-controlled media, and certain buildings, such as this one, also received broad praise. So postmodern forms as such did not carry an image of rebelliousness within the institution of Polish art, however you define this institution and however autonomous you think that it actually was. So to conclude, is the Ursynów Church an example for an architecture of resistance? At a disciplinary level, the answer has to be rather no. It does not contain an avant-garde aspect in the sense of Berger. It was not intended as a criticism of the discipline of architecture in the sense of Venturi or Eisenman. And it does not aim at returning architecture to the practice of life that, according to some, was lost in official architecture at the time. But does it carry an anti-socialist message? Well, clearly yes, because the vision of a return to national Catholic values, this image of a pre-modern church-oriented society, these are overt statements against the socialist regime, although expressed in a literal way. Here we see how the Polish context influenced meaning and significance of postmodern architecture and adapted that to a particular context. So, as I mentioned before, I would argue that the real conflictive potential does not really lie in the flamboyant forms or in these one-dimensional historic references, but rather in the bottom-up practice and in the redefinition of the urban space that happened as a result of that. To date, the most outstanding aspect of the church is its urban quality, and this could be deemed functionalism or postmodernism. There could be arguments that actually the square is a late functionalist adaptation, and it could be an argument that it is connected to postmodern planning principles, such as small scale, pedestrian orientation, mixed use, and a square, first and foremost, controlled by multiple actors, not by just the state authorities, but at least to a certain extent by the citizens, to a certain extent by the church. So while postmodern forms in Poland and elsewhere have lost their impact, the struggle over who owns and controls and uses the city is ongoing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Florian, for this fascinating presentation. I would like to ask the audience if there is any question. Okay.
Thank you very much. The thing I wanted to start with is actually that your ongoing research reminds me the research that actually Kuba Snopek was presented on the same, here on this conference actually 2 years ago. Okay. And this research actually ended up with a book called The Architecture of 7 Days. You actually showed this, but yes. Within this context, I have just, I have just short question. Are there any concrete reasons to highlight already, or let's say, already full researched topic, or it's kind of like postmodern joke? Thank you.
Well, the point I would see that is particularly relevant is to put the question of postmodernism into a broader context. I mentioned a church, and obviously the work by Kuba and his co-workers is focused on church architecture. But the debate over functionalism is something that extends beyond that. And I would say, although I have now presented a church example, I would avoid the trap of setting equal Polish postmodernism with sacred architecture, because one does not necessarily align with the two. And I would also say that the question of dissidence and rebelliousness and architectural disobedience in a way is not something that is exclusively connected to the church. As a matter of fact, there were different social movements in Poland in the 1970s and 80s, and not all were connected to the church, and not all sided actually with some of the ideas of the church. So I think this question is a broader example that should be set in an architectural context beyond sacred architecture.
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was absolutely fantastic. I would like to have three questions concerning your three theses. You said anti-socialist message through association with national Catholic references. How can a project, whatever project it is, hold an anti-socialistic message while it is the very part of the socialist system itself? How can that's my first question, on your last slide. I mean, these churches were having permissions from the state. There was a bunch of officials, people, politicians, spies, secret agents were infiltrating through the whole society, even Poland, only in Hungary. How can it be, if the pure fact that it was built is the part of the working of the system? Mm-hmm. How can it be then a criticism against the system if the system itself let it build up? I'm not criticizing, just really interested. We have got the very same thing in Hungary. Sorry, and I'm going to finish it myself because I've got another one. Excuse me. Could you please help me to go to your last slide? Yeah. How can a thing as a critical potential in the bottom-up design then of the form itself is so very architectural that even could be explained by the architect why the hell has he basically deconstructed the overall basilica system of a church. So on one hand we see an absolute autonomous formal thinking from the architect, then how can it be a bottom-up design? This is something up-bottom. If something is an example of the architectural form-making power, these churches, and in general the churches in our country too, in my country too, is the example of the powerful architect who decides the form. Yeah.
Okay, very, very good questions, actually. The first question I find particularly interesting because this is basically what is going to guide my research in the next 6 months when I'm going to be in Warsaw. I want to precisely look at the archives and say, well, how was this possible? I mean, obviously, we always speak about established system of power. We speak about totalitarianism, but we should not forget that in no socialist country or in no country wherever a system of power is actually perfect. So there's always leeway, even in North Korea there's leeway. So under socialism in Poland, this leeway, and particularly in the 1970s and 1980s, was bigger. So the extent of what is possible and what is not possible varied. Very much less was possible in the early 1950s, much more was possible in the late 1950s, etc. You have different struggles of power, and you have also different factions within the Polish Socialist Workers' Party. So, and some of them actually were more open to the church as others. So this idea of a church, for example, a party like you had in East Germany, where the party was completely opposed to the church. There was no infiltration. Party officials didn't go to church. There weren't these kind of things. This was not such a clear-cut opposition in Poland. And I mentioned only this, the sort of top of the thing that the head of the socialist state is swearing by God. There were many of these examples where actually the church had influence, and obviously it was used from the perspective of the officials to apaciguate rebellious potential. I say, well, before people are gonna be rebellious and do manifestations, we allowed him the church to build a church as a concession. So my hunch is that it was all negotiations like this. And don't forget that that compared to Ceausescu or to Brezhnev, the Polish leaders were never did never hold sway to such a strong extent as some other, even compared to Honecker and so on. So that's the first example. The second example is, well, I was talking about bottom-up aspects. This was not bottom-up design in the sense of that this came out of several people. This design is by Marek Budzyński and by Piotr Wicha, and later by this third guy, Zbigniew Badowski. So it's an architectural example. It's more how the church was built, which was bottom-up. It was the laborers, it was the volunteer work, and it was the fact that different people with different connections managed to come together on a Saturday and make these connections operable, to find bricks, to find something, and to. So the fact that how this was built, this was bottom up, not the design process.
If I may have another question, isn't it possible? What do you think if it's possible to change the train of thought and saying that the postmodern architecture is the sign of a certain kind of political liberalism in the socialist countries?
Well, I would. That was my first working hypothesis. I say, well, that's the last time. That's the style of the opposition, the style of the crumbling socialist state. But I actually came away from this hypothesis because it just opens many questions. First of all, there were official socialist buildings. There was not this opposition that the state was functionalist and the dissidents were postmodernists. There is. Well, I could go on. There are too many contradictions to do that. So I would say rather that oppositional ideas were projected on postmodern forms, rather than this was the carrier of the anti-socialist message.
I was wrong. That's not what I meant. Postmodern as such is not opposition, but a sign that you can do, that you are a bit more free. The more postmodernism you have, the more free you are, because the more expression you have, the chance for expression. Is it possible? Just a question.
I find it an interesting question, actually, yes, because I would ask myself that, for example, postmodernism as a mode of individual expression, as an anti-collective expression. But this is not something that loomed particularly large in the Polish context, as far as I remember it. At least not in the published materials. I haven't really interviewed anyone. But the idea of that this was individual was not pointed out. Also, the idea of anything goes was not pointed out. What was much more pointed out was this as an expression of, you could even say, collective national culture.
Yeah, I just want to actually answer your question, Andor. I mean, sadly enough, I see no sense in this discussion. I mean, I have to actually declare that all the question you're asking, you could actually find, the answer in this book, I was telling. And, I mean, I'm living in Poland. I mean, I don't really want even briefly discuss in the history of, let's say, of late socialist Poland. But let's say your first question about this bottom up. I mean, that you were wondering. It was actually, I mean, it happened because of this solidarity movement. Probably, you know. I mean, it was like really. I mean, let's say this solidarity movement was approximately, I don't know, for 12 years. I mean, for the last 12 years of Poland. I mean, let's say starting from 80s. So I mean, as you could see, actually, all these churches and so on, they were actually built within this period of solidarity that was, let's say, not really communistic anymore. I mean, I don't really remember your second question and the third one. Yeah, we could actually, discuss it later, because, yeah, that's great.
I'm very curious about them, by the way. And when I was, my whole childhood was spent watching in telly your solidarity movement. I mean, I remember Jaruzelski, the guys are protesting, so it was my whole childhood, basically, my whole childhood.
Okay, thank you. I think this will be continue after this. So thank you very much, Florian, for the lecture.